today I'll be talking about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act on tribal ownership of solar photovoltaics in Indian country. To start, a little about myself. I'm a law student also pursuing a master's in sustainable energy systems, and I've spent the past 2 summers working at law firms in the financing and development of renewable energy. Most of those projects were domestic here in the United States, but a few of them were international. I've been interested in advancing opportunities for energy sovereignty in Native communities, especially as we see the impacts of the Russian war on Ukraine. Today, I'll start by defining some terms, and then I'll talk about the societal need that motivated my research, moving into my research question, the methods I used, some key takeaways, and finally, a conclusion. So to start with defining terms, when I use the term tribal ownership, what I mean is that the majority of the project, more than 50%, is owned by either a tribal government or a tribal corporation formed under Section 17 of the Indian Reorganization Act. And the important piece here is that neither of these tribal entities are subject to taxation by the federal government. The second key piece is when I use the term Indian country, I mean the legal term, defined in Title 18 of the US Code, Section 1151. Indian country goes beyond just reservations to also include dependent Indian communities and Indian allotments. When I use the term Indian here, I'm using the legal term. So to give us an idea of what Indian country is, this is an imperfect map showing data from the US Census Bureau. The important thing here is just to note the general areas of where Indian country is, shown in blue, green, and purple. As you can see, there's a lot of Indian country in the southwestern United States, which is also a key part of the United States solar development area. So to start with the societal need motivating my research, the first is within Indian country, there's a general lack of electricity access, at least when compared to the rest of the United States. 14% of Indian households on reservations don't have access to electricity, compared to just 1% in the rest of the United States. At the same time, within Indian country, there's huge potential for renewable energy generation, both solar and wind. When we're talking about just solar, Indian country contains enough solar generation potential to provide 2 times the entire country's energy needs. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the entire United States puts their solar in Indian country to serve itself. And I'm not suggesting that all tribes need to develop solar energy. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that there's a clear problem here and a possible solution, and that tribes should have equal opportunity and parity to develop these developments on their land the same way that other people can develop on their land. So my research question: how will the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in August of 2022, impact tribal ownership of solar photovoltaics in Indian country? Ideally, I'd be able to look at the actual impact the Inflation Reduction Act has had. But since it was passed in August of 2022, and my research started in January of 2023, these developments take a lot of time. So unfortunately, we can't do that. Also, there's very limited research on this in general, and very limited experts that we can talk to. So to start, I performed a literature review to identify barriers that currently exist to tribal ownership of renewable energy developments and also to renewable energy developments in Indian country. I then analyzed the text of the Inflation Reduction Act, which contains provisions on all sorts of stuff. Specifically, I was looking to find the provisions that impact tribes, that impact renewable energy development, and that impact Indian country. I then performed a comparative analysis. My comparative analysis had 2 sort of parts to it. The first part was to find other laws in other industries that changed things in the same way the Inflation Reduction Act changed things, and to identify how those changes impact Indian country or impacted tribes. The second part was to identify other federal laws that attempted to increase tribal ownership of renewable energy developments or renewable energy developments in Indian country, and see what impact that had. Finally, I talked to a number of experts. These experts were either legal experts who work in the financing development of renewable energy, or they were renewable energy developers, to try and identify what they thought would be the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act. What I want to leave you with today is a few key takeaways from my research. The first is that if this is something you're interested in, I encourage you to work on it because there just isn't that much there, and this is a super important problem. The second, federal subsidies to renewable energy developments now apply to tribes. Historically, if a non-tribal owner was to develop renewable energy, they would be eligible for 40% cost subsidy from the federal government in the form of federal tax credits. These projects cost millions to billions of dollars, so a 40% cost subsidy is significant. If a tribe were to own the same development, at least before the Inflation Reduction Act, they wouldn't be eligible for these subsidies because they don't pay federal taxes. So they'd get 0% of this subsidy, where others would get 40%. The IRA contains a provision to make tribes eligible for some of this subsidy by enabling them to elect for cash in lieu of the tax credits. This means that a tribe can now receive 30% cost subsidy. There's a question as to whether this 10% differential that exists still between tribal ownership, where they can get 30% cost subsidy, and non-tribal ownership, where they can get 40% subsidy, is significant or not. The second key takeaway is that there's a lot more federal money on the table. Now, the key thing to note here is even though these numbers look big, it's not as easy as just going to the bank and withdrawing the money, right? These are money that's generally coming in the form of grants, which at times can be competitive grants, or have severe regulations surrounding them. If you forget to check a box, you don't get the money. If you don't follow the rules, you don't get the money. So the Inflation Reduction Act provides up to $720 million in direct funding for tribes across a few different areas, including clean energy, electrification, and climate resilience. The second is it increases loan authority under the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program from $2 billion to $20 billion, and provides $75 million to the Loan Guarantee Program to carry out its programs. This includes direct loans and also loan guarantees. The third is it increases the tax subsidy available if the renewable energy development is located in a low income or a tribal community. This tax subsidy is part of the eligible for direct payment from the federal government. So even though I'm using the word tax, tribes are still eligible to get this 10 to 20% increase in the subsidy. The third key takeaway is that there's many ongoing challenges that are partially addressed by the Inflation Reduction Act or remain unaddressed by the Inflation Reduction Act. The first of these is limited transmission and interconnection infrastructure. Generally, Indian country is located in rural areas, and in these rural areas, there isn't as much transmission and interconnection. While the Inflation Reduction Act provides money specifically for transmission and interconnection projects, the cost of the transmission and interconnection is immense, and it's hard to overcome. The second is there's general barriers to obtaining financing in Indian country. This exists outside of just the renewable energy market, but every single industry. The federal government attempts to help with this by providing these grants, loans, some of which are forgivable. But as I said, it's not as easy as just going forth and grabbing the money. The third is operating in Indian country comes with complex and uncertain legal questions, a lot of which remain unresolved. This tends to increase the risk of projects, especially if there are outside investors. Further, it increases the time it may take to develop a project or figure out permits or approvals that are necessary, which also increases the cost. So now what? Well, I'm developing a fact sheet on the information that the Inflation Reduction Act, on the incentives that the Inflation Reduction Act provides to help inform tribal governments and technical service providers of available incentives. To be clear, this fact sheet is not trying to promote solar developments or not promote solar developments. It's simply to help alleviate the complexity and the time with which someone would have to go to understand what are the incentives available to me through the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm also working on ongoing collaborative research with Carly Moore, who's sitting right over here, who's an E-IPER second-year PhD student on agrivoltaics, which is the co-location of agriculture and photovoltaics in Indian country. Thank you so much. I'm now available for any questions.
Yeah, I was just curious, the 40-30% difference was really interesting. Did you come across, like in your research, why it came out that way? 40-30% in your research?
Yeah, there is. So the federal government, through the investment tax credit, provides approximately a 30% cost subsidy on the cost of projects. The additional 10%, which again is an approximation, is from depreciation, which is a tax benefit from depreciating assets that businesses can take advantage of. And while the Inflation Reduction Act provides a direct pay provision for the investment tax credit, it doesn't provide it for the depreciation. So tribes are not able to take advantage of that sort of tax benefit that exists for projects elsewhere. Yeah?
I'm curious about the ways in which you think the Inflation Reduction Act will change the calculus in terms of tribes' ability to own their own projects. Obviously, the direct pay completely changes things, but are there other provisions that you encountered that you feel like will kind of make it easier for tribes to own and operate their own projects?
I think the direct pay is the biggest provision. I think some of the federal money on the table could potentially change things, but unfortunately, and this is sort of a negative outlook, so I'm sorry for sharing it. A couple of the developers I spoke with basically were sort of like fighting the question. They said, well, I don't understand, like, why don't tribes just own like a small part of the project and someone else can own all the equipment and the rest of the project and it could happen in Indian country? And I said, because that's not the point. And they said, okay, well, I have another idea. What if the tribe is a partner in this project that occurs outside of Indian country? And it was like, that's not the point. So I think if we're focusing on economics of things, that might be the wrong question. If we're focusing on like, how can this help the community, or how can this be something for sovereignty or for, cultural revitalization, that's the right question. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act makes the economics make more sense, but it doesn't necessarily make the economics make sense the way it makes sense for projects outside of Indian country. Yeah.
So it sounds like at the end there you have your big challenges and that led to opportunities. And it seemed like so far the fact sheet is kind of one opportunity just to get the information out there and make sure everybody knows what's what. This may be covered in your broader project or subsequent thinking on your part. Is there anything else you could think of, like a startup or an NGO that would actually inform people how to use that information, since you would be an ideal person or group to do that, since you're taking the time to develop the most useful information?
Yeah, definitely. So Carly and I have actually spent time working with a tribal renewable energy developer. They're relatively new, but they're tribal owned, and their goal is to help tribes develop renewable energy on their own. So they would actually be sort of a perfect partner for this work.
For the record, I did not know. But I still think it's the first you did it.
Thank you.